The freezing wind cuts across the Korean peninsula like a blade. It is November 1950, and a column of British soldiers trudges through mountain passes they cannot name, toward an enemy they barely understand. Among them, young conscripts who weeks ago were working factory floors in Manchester or tending shops in Birmingham. Now they grip rifles with numb fingers, breath turning to fog, wondering how a war on the other side of the world became their war. And rolling alongside them, machines that had seen combat before. Tanks and ships and guns designed for a conflict that ended 5 years prior. Relics, some called them. But these relics were about to write a new chapter in military history. Welcome. If you are new here, subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from. This is the story of why Britain sent yesterday's weapons to fight tomorrow's war. To understand why Britain arrived in Korea with equipment from a previous era, we must first understand the state of the British Empire in 1950. The Second World War had bled the nation dry. Financially, Britain owed billions to the United States. The economy staggered under rationing that continued years after victory. The military, once the mightiest force on earth, had been drastically reduced. Demobilization sent millions of soldiers home, and the arsenals that had churned out Spitfires and Sherman tanks fell quiet. Britain still maintained global commitments. Colonies and protectorates stretched from Hong Kong to Kenya, from Malaya to the Middle East. Each required garrisons, each demanded resources. The empire was overstretched, exhausted, and deeply in debt. When North Korean forces poured across the 38th parallel on June 25, 1950, Britain faced a dilemma. The United Nations called for member states to assist South Korea. The United States, leading the charge, expected its wartime ally to contribute. Refusing would damage the special relationship that British leaders considered essential to national security, but accepting meant sending troops and equipment that Britain could barely spare. Prime Minister Clement Attlee's government made the decision quickly. Britain would contribute ground forces, naval vessels, and air support. The commitment to collective security and the need to demonstrate relevance on the world stage outweighed the logistical nightmares. The Royal Navy responded first. Within weeks of the invasion, British warships steamed toward Korean waters. Among them was HMS Belfast, a town-class light cruiser that had already earned its place in history. Belfast had been commissioned in 1939. During the Second World War, she participated in the sinking of the German battlecruiser Scharnhorst. She escorted Arctic convoys through frozen seas. She provided fire support during the Normandy landings. By 1950, Belfast was over a decade old. Naval technology had advanced considerably. New cruisers incorporated radar systems and fire control mechanisms that made Belfast's equipment seem antiquated. Yet here she was, ordered to Korea because Britain had nothing better to send. Belfast arrived in Korean waters in the summer of 1950 and immediately went to work. Her 6-inch guns pounded North Korean positions along the coast. She provided fire support for amphibious operations and interdicted enemy supply lines. The ship's crew adapted to conditions utterly different from the North Atlantic. Instead of German submarines, they faced shore batteries. Instead of freezing convoys, they dealt with the sweltering heat of Korean summers, followed by brutal winters. Belfast would serve multiple tours in Korea, her guns wearing down from constant use. She fired more rounds in Korea than she had during the entirety of the Second World War. The decision to send Belfast illustrated Britain's predicament. The Royal Navy possessed newer vessels, but many were committed elsewhere. The Mediterranean required a presence. The Far East Fleet guarded against potential threats in Malaya and Hong Kong. Korea received what could be spared, and what could be spared were ships that had already proved themselves in another war. This pattern repeated across all branches of the British military. On land, the situation was similar. The British Army in 1950 relied heavily on equipment designed during or shortly after the Second World War. When the 27th Infantry Brigade arrived in Korea in August 1950, they brought weapons familiar to any veteran of the European theater: Lee Enfield rifles, Bren guns, Vickers machine guns. These were reliable tools tested in combat, but they were not new. Soldiers trained on equipment their fathers might have carried. The doctrine remained rooted in lessons learned fighting Germans and Japanese. Korea would demand rapid adaptation. The armor situation presented particular challenges. Britain's armored forces in 1950 operated a mix of vehicles. The Cromwell tank, a mainstay of British armored divisions in 1944 and 45, still equipped many units. The Cromwell had served adequately against German forces in the final year of the war, but it was never considered exceptional. Its armor could not withstand hits from the heavier German tanks, and its guns struggled against well-armored targets. By 1950, the Cromwell was undeniably obsolete. Its presence in Korea became something of an embarrassment when North Korean forces captured several examples, displaying them as trophies of British weakness. But Britain had something else in the pipeline, something that would redeem the nation's armored reputation and establish a legacy lasting decades. The Centurion tank had been designed during the final years of the Second World War. Engineers drew upon every lesson learned from fighting German armor. They prioritized protection, firepower, and reliability. The first Centurions rolled off production lines in 1945, but they arrived too late to see combat in Europe. For 5 years, the Centurion remained untested in actual warfare. Korea would change that. The Centurions arrived in Korea in late 1950, assigned to the 8th King's Royal Irish Hussars. These tanks represented the cutting edge of British armor technology. Their 17-pounder guns could destroy any enemy vehicle on the peninsula. Their armor, though not impervious, offered protection far superior to any tank North Korea or China could field. Most importantly, the Centurion proved remarkably reliable. In the mountainous terrain of Korea, where supply lines stretched thin and maintenance facilities were primitive, reliability mattered enormously. Tanks that broke down became liabilities. Tanks that kept running became assets. The Centurion's first major test came during the Battle of the Imjin River in April 1951. By then, Chinese forces had entered the war, transforming what had seemed like imminent victory into desperate defense. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers pushed south, overwhelming United Nations positions through sheer numbers. The British 29th Infantry Brigade held positions along the Imjin River, directly in the path of the Chinese offensive. Among the units was the 1st Battalion Gloucestershire Regiment. The Gloucesters, as they were known, would write one of the most heroic chapters of the entire war. The Chinese attacked on the night of April 22nd. Waves of infantry surged across the river, supported by artillery and mortar fire. The Gloucesters held Hill 235, a strategic position controlling approaches to Seoul. For 3 days and nights, fewer than 700 British soldiers faced an enemy numbering in the tens of thousands. The fighting was close and brutal. Chinese soldiers attacked in human wave assaults, climbing over the bodies of their fallen comrades. The Gloucesters fought with rifles and bayonets, with grenades and bare hands. Ammunition ran low, casualties mounted, yet they held. Lieutenant Colonel James Carn commanded the Gloucesters during the battle. His leadership became legendary. When communications failed, he moved among his men, calm under fire, directing the defense. When positions became untenable, he organized fighting withdrawals that maintained unit cohesion. When capture became inevitable, he ensured his men understood their duty. Carn would spend nearly 2 years as a prisoner of war, enduring solitary confinement and harsh treatment, never breaking. He carved a Celtic cross from stone during his captivity, a testament to faith and resilience. For his actions at the Imjin, Karn received the Victoria Cross. The centurions supporting the 29th Brigade proved their worth during these desperate days. Their guns broke up Chinese concentrations. Their armor absorbed hits that would have destroyed lighter vehicles. When the order came to withdraw, centurions provided covering fire, allowing infantry to fall back in order. The tanks could not prevent the Chinese from overrunning Hill 235. Nothing could have prevented that. But they bought time. Time for other units to establish new defensive lines. Time for Seoul to be reinforced. Time for the United Nations Command to organize a coherent response. The stand at the Imjin River cost the Gloucesters dearly. More than 500 men were killed or captured. Only a handful escaped to friendly lines. The battalion effectively ceased to exist as a fighting formation. Yet their sacrifice delayed the Chinese advance long enough to prevent a complete breakthrough. Military historians would later calculate that the Gloucesters bought 48 crucial hours. In those hours, the United Nations forces reorganized. The Chinese offensive, though still dangerous, lost momentum. Seoul did not fall. If you are still watching, take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe. Your support helps bring more stories like this to life. Now, let us continue. The Korean War revealed uncomfortable truths about the state of British military power. The empire that had stood against Nazi Germany now struggled to equip a single infantry brigade properly. Soldiers arrived in Korea wearing uniforms designed for European winters, utterly inadequate for Korean conditions. The cold there was different. It came with a wind that cut through wool and leather, driving temperatures far below what any British soldier had experienced. Frostbite claimed as many casualties as enemy action in the winter months. Equipment failures compounded the suffering. Vehicles designed for temperate climates refused to start in the extreme cold. Lubricants froze. Batteries died. Weapons jammed when their mechanisms iced over. British soldiers learned to sleep with their rifles, keeping the metal warm enough to function. They learned to urinate on frozen bolt mechanisms to free them. These were not tactics taught in training. They were survival adaptations developed in the field, passed from veteran to replacement, written in the hard currency of experience. The logistical chain stretched impossibly thin. Supplies traveled from Britain around the Cape of Good Hope, through the Suez Canal, across the Indian Ocean, to ports in Japan, then by ship and truck to frontline positions. The journey took months. Equipment ordered in October might arrive in February. Replacements for losses had to be anticipated far in advance. Commanders learned to hoard supplies, to improvise, to make do with what they had. The tradition of British military resourcefulness, born in colonial campaigns, found new expression in Korean mountains. National service conscripts formed the backbone of the British contribution. Since 1948, every able-bodied British male faced 2 years of military service. These were not volunteers. They were young men, 18 and 19 years old, pulled from civilian lives and thrust into uniforms. Many had never traveled beyond their home counties. Now they found themselves in a country they could not locate on a map, fighting an enemy they did not understand, for reasons that seemed abstract and distant. The contrast between professional soldiers and conscripts created tensions within British units. Regular Army veterans, many with years of experience, sometimes viewed the national servicemen as liabilities, undertrained, unmotivated, prone to mistakes that cost lives. The conscripts, for their part, resented being treated as second-class soldiers. They had not chosen this war. They had not asked to die in Korea. Yet many performed with remarkable courage when the moment demanded it. The distinctions between regular and conscript blurred in combat. Bullets did not discriminate based on enlistment status. Training for Korea was hasty and inadequate. Units received deployment orders with little warning. Soldiers might have weeks, at most, to prepare for a war on the other side of the world. Language training was non-existent. Cultural preparation amounted to brief lectures about Asian communism. Most British soldiers arrived in Korea knowing nothing of the country, its people, its history. They saw mountains and rice paddies, villages of mud and thatch, a landscape utterly alien to anything in their experience. Communication with Korean civilians required interpreters, who were scarce. Misunderstandings were common. Tragic mistakes occurred. The relationship between British forces and their American allies also required navigation. The United States provided the overwhelming majority of United Nations troops in Korea. American commanders made the strategic decisions. American logistics sustained the war effort. British forces operated under American command, a subordinate position that graded on officers accustomed to British independence. Cultural differences emerged in everything from tactics to cuisine. Americans seemed to British eyes excessively reliant on firepower, willing to call in airstrikes and artillery for problems that infantry could solve. The British approach emphasized economy of force, precision, making do with less. Both approaches had merits, both had costs. General Douglas MacArthur, the American commander, presented particular challenges for British leadership. His aggressive strategy, particularly his drive toward the Chinese border in late 1950, alarmed London. British intelligence suggested Chinese intervention was likely if United Nations forces approached the Yalu River. MacArthur dismissed these warnings. His confidence proved catastrophic when 300,000 Chinese soldiers poured into Korea in November 1950, catching American and South Korean forces unprepared. The retreat that followed was among the worst disasters in American military history. British units performed well during the Chinese intervention. Their disciplined fighting withdrawals contrasted with the chaos in some American formations. The 29th Brigade maintained cohesion even as the front collapsed around them. Professional soldiers and conscripts alike demonstrated that British military tradition retained potency even in reduced circumstances. These performances earned respect from American allies and contributed to a mythology of British steadfastness that leaders in London found useful. The special relationship strained by American unilateralism benefited from British bloodshed in Korean snow. HMS Belfast continued operations throughout the war. Her guns supported amphibious operations and bombarded enemy positions. Her crew endured conditions that ranged from tropical heat to Arctic cold. The ship's engineering plant, designed in the 1930s, required constant maintenance. Her fire control systems, advanced for their time, struggled with the precision demands of shore bombardment. Yet Belfast served with distinction, demonstrating that age did not preclude effectiveness. The cruiser became a symbol of British naval commitment, visible proof that the Royal Navy remained a global force. Other naval vessels contributed to the British effort. Aircraft carriers like HMS Triumph and HMS Glory provided air support for ground operations. Their embarked Seafire and Firefly aircraft flew thousands of sorties, attacking enemy supply lines and providing close air support. These aircraft, like so much British equipment, dated from the Second World War. They lacked the speed and firepower of American jets, but they operated from carriers that American fleet carriers could not match in numbers. Britain contributed what it could, and what it could contribute was often equipment designed for a previous war. The Royal Air Force contribution proved more limited. RAF units participated in Korea, but the majority of air operations fell to American and Commonwealth forces. Australian pilots flew Mustangs and Meteors in ground attack missions. South African squadrons operated alongside American units. The British presence in the air remained modest, a reflection of competing commitments elsewhere in the world. Malaya demanded air resources for counterinsurgency operations. The Middle East required coverage against potential Soviet threats. Korea received attention, but not priority. The war settled into stalemate by mid-1951. neither side could achieve decisive victory. The front stabilized roughly along the 38th parallel where the war had begun. Negotiations commenced at Kaesong, later moving to Panmunjom. These talks would drag on for 2 years, punctuated by fighting that continued even as diplomats argued. British forces participated in this grinding warfare, holding positions, conducting patrols, enduring artillery bombardments. The nature of the war changed during the stalemate period. Instead of sweeping maneuvers and dramatic advances, fighting centered on individual hills and ridgelines. Positions received names that became synonymous with sacrifice: the Hook, Porkchop Hill, Old Baldy. British soldiers defended these positions against Chinese attacks, launched raids to gather intelligence, endured shelling that seemed endless. The landscape became a moonscape, cratered by artillery, stripped of vegetation, littered with debris. Soldiers lived in bunkers and trenches, emerging only for patrols or attacks. The Cold War context shaped British thinking throughout the conflict. Korea was not an end in itself. It was a front in a global struggle against communism. British leaders worried that Korea might be a diversion, drawing Western attention from more critical theaters. Europe remained the primary concern. Soviet forces in Eastern Europe vastly outnumbered NATO defenders. A war in Europe would determine the fate of Western civilization. Korea, however important symbolically, was peripheral to this existential struggle. This perspective influenced British force contributions. London committed enough to demonstrate solidarity, but not so much as to compromise European defense. The tension between Asian and European commitments created friction with Washington. Americans, focused on rolling back communism where it advanced, found British caution frustrating. The British, haunted by memories of 1940 and the fall of France, refused to denude European garrisons for Korean operations. Both allies had valid concerns. Neither fully understood the other's perspective. The Centurion tank emerged from Korea with an enhanced reputation. Its performance validated design decisions made years earlier. The emphasis on protection, firepower, and reliability proved prescient. Centurions engaged enemy tanks at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters, destroying targets with single shots. They survived hits that would have destroyed earlier designs. Most importantly, they kept running. In conditions that broke down American Shermans and Pershings, Centurions maintained operational readiness rates that astonished logisticians. The lessons learned in Korea shaped Centurion development for decades. Later marks incorporated improvements based on combat experience: larger guns, better fire control, enhanced armor. The Centurion evolved through multiple variants, serving British forces until the 1960s and remaining in service with other nations much longer. Some militaries used Centurions into the 1980s. The tank that first saw combat in Korea became one of the most successful armored vehicles in history. A strange outcome for what began as a wartime design rushed into production too late for its intended war. Before we continue with the final phase of this story, remember to subscribe if you have not already, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Now, let us examine the legacy of Britain's Korean commitment. The armistice came on July 27, 1953. It was not a peace treaty. Technically, the war never ended. The two Koreas remained divided, separated by a demilitarized zone that persists to this day. British forces had served continuously throughout the conflict, rotating units in and out of the peninsula. The final tally was significant. Nearly 60,000 British troops had served in Korea. More than 1,000 had died. Thousands more were wounded or taken prisoner. The prisoners of war endured particular suffering. Chinese and North Korean captors subjected them to political indoctrination, what became known as brainwashing. Prisoners faced pressure to sign confessions denouncing Western imperialism. Some broke under torture. Others resisted, maintaining their integrity despite unimaginable hardship. The experiences of these men emerged gradually after the war, revealing the psychological dimensions of Cold War conflict. Physical courage was not enough. Mental resilience mattered equally. Lieutenant Colonel Carnes' Celtic Cross became a symbol of this resilience. Carved from stone during months of solitary confinement, it represented faith maintained under pressure. Carnes never broke. His captors could not shake his resolve, could not extract the propaganda they wanted. When he finally returned to Britain, Carnes received a hero's welcome. The cross he carved is preserved today, a tangible artifact of courage that transcended physical circumstances. The human cost extended beyond casualties. Veterans returned to a Britain that had largely forgotten them. The Korean War never captured public imagination like the Second World War. There were no victory parades, no national celebrations. Men who had fought with distinction found themselves ignored, their sacrifices unrecognized. The conflict acquired a reputation as the Forgotten War, a designation that stung veterans who had given so much. This forgetting had multiple causes. The war ended ambiguously, with neither victory nor defeat but stalemate. The divided Korea that emerged seemed to suggest the fighting had accomplished little. China remained communist. North Korea remained hostile. The Cold War continued unabated. What, veterans might ask, had been the point? The question had no satisfying answer. They had fought because their country asked them to fight. The strategic justifications remained abstract, unconvincing to men who had seen friends die in frozen valleys. The equipment that Britain sent to Korea told a story of imperial decline. Ships and tanks and aircraft designed for one war pressed into service for another. This was not unique to Britain. All nations improvise in war, using what they have rather than what they would prefer. But the British experience in Korea illustrated the gap between national ambition and national capability. Britain wanted to remain a great power, a force for global stability. Britain could barely equip the forces it sent to support that ambition. The Centurion's success offered consolation. Here was proof that British engineering remained world-class. The tank that dominated Korean battlefields would find buyers across the globe. Countries seeking reliable armor chose Centurion because Korea had proved its worth. This commercial success funded further development, keeping British armored vehicle production viable for another generation. The Cold War created markets for weapons, and weapons that performed well in actual combat commanded premium prices. HMS Belfast survived the war and continued serving the Royal Navy until 1963. By then, she was one of the oldest cruisers in service, a genuine relic of a vanishing era. Her final fate proved more dignified than scrapping. Belfast was preserved as a museum ship moored on the Thames in London. Today, visitors can walk her decks, explore her compartments, imagine the conditions endured by her crew. The ship's Korean service receives prominent attention in museum displays. What might have ended as scrap metal became a memorial to naval heritage. The broader legacy of British involvement in Korea proved more complex. The war demonstrated British willingness to support collective security, earning goodwill in Washington and among allies. It also exposed British limitations, the inability to project decisive power without American support. These lessons shaped British defense policy for decades. London accepted a subordinate role in the Western Alliance, contributing where it could, acknowledging that leadership had passed to the United States. National service continued until 1963, partly justified by Korean experiences. The war showed that conscript armies could perform effectively, that young men pulled from civilian lives could fight and die with courage. But conscription also had costs. It interrupted careers and education. It imposed burdens unevenly, with exemptions favoring the connected and fortunate. The end of national service came as technology changed warfare, making mass armies seem obsolete. What Korea proved possible, nuclear weapons made unnecessary. The veterans aged and diminished. Each year, fewer remained to share their memories. Korean War associations formed, organizing reunions, advocating for recognition. Gradually, public awareness increased. Monuments were erected. Services of remembrance were held. The Korean War Memorial in London, dedicated in 1997, honored the British dead with a dignified simplicity. Names inscribed in stone, a reminder of sacrifice that might otherwise be forgotten. South Korea transformed in the decades following the armistice. From a war-devastated ruin, it became an economic powerhouse. The sacrifice of United Nations forces, including British soldiers, preserved the possibility of this transformation. Had the North prevailed, the entire peninsula would have fallen under communist rule. The prosperity of modern South Korea owes something to the men who held the Imjin River, who defended the Pusan perimeter, who endured the frozen retreat from the Yalu. The equipment Britain sent to Korea deserves its place in this history. The relics, as some called them, proved their worth. HMS Belfast's guns supported operations from beginning to end. Centurion tanks established a reputation that lasted decades. Even the older equipment, the Lee Enfield rifles and Bren guns, performed reliably in conditions that tested every piece of kit. Britain's contribution reflected adaptation and resourcefulness, making do with what was available, accomplishing missions despite limitations. The designation of this equipment as relics obscures an important truth. Weapons do not become obsolete instantly. Designs that served in one war often serve in the next. The Lee Enfield that equipped British soldiers in Korea was essentially the same rifle carried in the trenches of the First World War. It still fired accurately. It still killed enemies. Age matters less than function. The relics performed their functions in Korea, and performing functions is what weapons exist to do. The decision to send these relics reflected cold calculation rather than carelessness. Britain could not produce new equipment quickly enough to meet Korean demands. Existing stocks had to be utilized. This meant sending ships designed in the 1930s and tanks designed in the 1940s. The alternative was sending nothing, and sending nothing was unacceptable. Cold War politics required visible commitment. Relics were better than absence. The Korean War demonstrated that equipment alone does not determine outcomes. Training, leadership, morale, logistics, all mattered more than any single weapon system. British soldiers with outdated rifles outperformed North Korean troops with modern Soviet weapons. The Centurion's success owed as much to crew training as to armor thickness. Technology enables, but does not guarantee. Human factors remain decisive, even in mechanized warfare. The story of Britain's Korean commitment defies simple narratives. It was neither triumph nor disaster, but something more ambiguous. Men fought and died far from home in a war most of their countrymen would forget. They used equipment designed for different circumstances, adapting as soldiers always adapt. They achieved neither the decisive victory their commanders hoped for, nor the catastrophic defeat their enemies sought. They held lines, bought time, contributed to an outcome that remained unsatisfying but prevented something worse. The relics returned from Korea, bearing scars of service. HMS Belfast steamed home with guns worn from firing. Centurion tanks, battered but functional, were refurbished for continued service. These machines had proved themselves in conditions more demanding than any test range. Their survival validated design decisions. Their performance informed future development. The Korean crucible forged lessons that shaped military thinking for generations. Standing on the deck of HMS Belfast today, preserved in London as a memorial, visitors can imagine what her crew experienced. The confined spaces, the constant noise, the tension of shore bombardment, knowing enemy guns might reply. The ship seems impossibly small for the tasks she performed, yet perform she did for 3 years in Korean waters, a relic that refused to accept obsolescence. Her service honored traditions stretching back centuries, Royal Navy ships in distant waters, supporting British interests, demonstrating global reach. The Centurions left a different legacy. No preserved examples from Korean service survive in Britain. The tanks wore out, were upgraded, were replaced. But the design philosophy lived on. The British main battle tank concept, emphasizing protection and firepower, traces directly to Centurion and its Korean success. Challenger tanks, still in British service today, inherit DNA from the vehicles that fought at the Imjin River. The lessons of Korea shaped armor design for 70 years. The human legacy matters most. The veterans, those who survived, carried Korea with them. Some spoke of their experiences. Others maintained silence, unable or unwilling to share what they had seen. The memories faded with time, details blurring, certainties dissolving. But something remained, a bond forged in shared hardship, pride in service, however ambivalent. Recognition that they had participated in history, even if that history remained obscure. Britain sent relics to Korea because Britain had relics to send. The nation that emerged from the Second World War was exhausted, diminished, clinging to great power status through determination as much as capability. The equipment shipped to Korean ports embodied this condition. Old ships, old tanks, old rifles in young hands. What mattered was not the age of the weapons, but the willingness to use them. Britain was willing. That willingness cost lives. It also preserved something worth preserving both in Korea and in Britain's conception of itself. The story ends without ending. The Korean War technically continues, suspended rather than concluded. The relics that fought there have passed into memory and museum exhibits. The veterans have mostly joined their fallen comrades. But the peninsula they fought for remains divided, the tensions they confronted unresolved. Their war achieved stalemate, and stalemate persists. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps preventing defeat is victory of a kind. The relics did their duty. The men who operated them did theirs. History judges, but history also forgets. This story, at least, will be remembered. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with others who appreciate military history. Leave a comment below. Until next time.